You're fired. You're no longer needed in this company.
Now the idiot will truly know who owns this company. Yes, ma'am, it's time.
Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment.
Please subscribe to our channel.
Yes, please subscribe. We would really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
The rain had started before dawn on the morning Arthur Barnes was buried, coating the black cars, marble steps, and rows of umbrellas in a cold silver sheen that made the entire cemetery look like a painting of grief. Sabrina Barnes stood beside the grave in a simple black coat, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her face calm in a way that worried the few people who knew her well. She was 32, soft-spoken, observant, and known in private circles as Arthur Barnes's only child, the daughter of a man who had built Barnes Global Holdings from a regional freight company into one of the most respected logistics and infrastructure empires in the northeastern United States. Yet Sabrina looked nothing like the heiress the business papers would soon begin describing. There were no diamonds at her throat, no dramatic display of wealth, no entourages whispering around her. Only her cousin Linda Churchill stood close enough to notice how Sabrina's thumb pressed into her own palm, a small sign that the woman everyone believed to be composed was carrying a storm inside. Around them were board members, attorneys, family acquaintances, and opportunists already thinking of succession, control, and headlines. Arthur had died after a sudden illness that moved faster than anyone expected, and in the quiet chaos that followed, many had assumed Sabrina would step into the spotlight at once, pose for the cameras, inherit the office on the top floor, and continue her father's legacy exactly as tradition demanded. But Sabrina's silence at the graveside did not come from weakness. It came from memory. She remembered being 14 and watching her father stay late at the office during a snowstorm because warehouse staff had no heat. She remembered him saying that titles made people careless, and that the true soul of a company could only be known by how the invisible people inside it were treated. While condolences passed around her like rehearsed lines from strangers reading a script, Sabrina made a decision so unusual and so dangerous that no one there, not the board, not the attorneys, not even the distant cousins measuring inheritance with their eyes, could have predicted it. She would inherit everything, but she would not reveal herself. She would watch first. She would learn first. She would find out who the loyal ones were before power could make liars bow and schemers smile. 3 nights after the funeral, in a private library inside Arthur Barnes's brownstone in Boston, Sabrina met with Linda Churchill, Ethan Walker, and Victor Langston under the yellow glow of antique lamps. The room still carried the scent of cedar shells and Arthur's old tobacco-free cologne, and on the center table sat a stack of sealed documents that would decide the future of Barnes Global Holdings. Linda, elegant and sharp in a navy dress, looked every bit like the kind of woman Wall Street magazines loved to photograph. She had a public ease Sabrina never wanted, a commanding presence that could quiet a room before she even sat down. Ethan Walker, Sabrina's childhood friend and now the family's trusted legal advisor, paced slowly with a pen in his hand, reviewing the structure he had helped design. Victor Langston, one of the oldest board members and one of the few men whose loyalty had belonged to Arthur before money made everyone else unpredictable, sat with his cane resting against the chair, studying Sabrina with grave approval. It was there Sabrina announced the plan in full. Linda would become the public face of the company, the acting CEO known to the world, while Sabrina would remain the hidden owner and majority controller. Ethan immediately outlined the legal shield that would protect the arrangement, layer by layer, through holding entities, signed authorizations, and private board resolutions. Victor warned that such secrecy could become dangerous if the wrong people grew too bold, but Sabrina did not retreat. She explained, with painful clarity, that she had spent too many years watching polished executives flatter her father in boardrooms and dismiss janitors in corridors. She had seen managers praise ethics in public while crushing lower staff in private. If she entered openly as owner, every smile would become a performance. Every loyalty would become suspect. She wanted to know how the company breathed when no one knew the heiress was watching. Linda listened in silence before finally reaching across the table and taking Sabrina's hand, promising that she would bear the public burden if Sabrina bore the hidden one. Outside, wind rattled the old windows like impatient fingers, but inside that room a secret empire was reborn in a form no rival could imagine. Before the meeting ended, they signed the papers, sealed the structure, and agreed on one iron rule: no one beyond that room would know the truth. To the world, Linda Churchill would be CEO. To reality, Sabrina Barnes would remain what her father made her, the owner of everything. A month later, while financial reporters speculated about Barnes Global's smooth leadership transition and photographed Linda entering headquarters in Manhattan, Sabrina walked through the same building by a different entrance with an employee badge clipped to her modest blouse. The headquarters stood on Lexington Avenue, all glass walls, controlled doors, polished stone, and quiet intimidation. But Sabrina entered not through the executive lobby where Linda was welcomed by assistants and cameras, but through the staff entrance used by administrative teams and operations personnel. She had chosen a mid-level operations role under a shortened internal profile, enough to move through departments without attracting curiosity, and she kept her appearance exactly as she preferred it: simple coat, practical shoes, tied-back hair, no designer labels, no effort to signal importance. On her first day, she rode the elevator with clerks, analysts, and support workers who talked about subway delays, childcare costs, rent increases, and managers who only remembered their names when mistakes had to be blamed on someone. Sabrina listened more than she spoke. She noticed which supervisors greeted receptionists and which ones looked through them. She noticed a warehouse coordinator being ignored in a meeting until a male manager repeated her point and received applause. She noticed cafeteria staff treated with more sincerity by exhausted interns than by polished executives carrying strategy decks. In operations, she worked carefully, learning schedules, routes, procurement patterns, and internal habits from the ground up, surprising her immediate teammates with how quickly she understood pressure points in the business. Grace Morgan from Human Resources crossed paths with her once and took note of the quiet competence in her eyes. Down in compliance, Daniel Brooks argued over delayed approvals with a temper that came from overwork, not cruelty. In a corner office 3 floors above, men in expensive suits spoke confidently about efficiency without ever visiting the loading docks whose exhaustion funded their bonuses. Sabrina went home each evening not to celebration, but to notebooks filled with observations: who led with decency, who abused small power, who listened, who lied, who pretended. The company her father built was strong, but beneath its polished surface she could already sense fault lines spreading like hidden cracks under ice. And as she sat alone that first Friday night in her quiet apartment, removing her badge and placing it beside a framed photograph of Arthur Barnes smiling in shirtsleeves at a warehouse opening years earlier, Sabrina understood that inheriting an empire was not the hardest part. The hardest part would be discovering whether the people inside it deserved to remain when the truth finally came out. Jonathan Price arrived in New York on a cold autumn morning with only 2 suitcases, a worn laptop, and a determination that had been burning inside him since childhood. The towering skyline looked intimidating to many newcomers, but to Jonathan it looked like possibility. Growing up in Detroit, he had watched his father, Michael Price, spend long days repairing broken engines in a small garage while his mother Helen managed their modest neighborhood grocery store. Life had never been easy for the Price family. Bills were always a little late, opportunities always seemed just out of reach, and Jonathan often studied under dim lights when electricity bills forced the household to conserve power. Yet his parents never allowed him to believe poverty defined his future. Michael would tell him while wiping grease from his hands that the world respected people who worked harder than everyone else. Helen reminded him every evening that education was a doorway no one could permanently close. Those words shaped Jonathan's entire life. He studied relentlessly, earned scholarships, and graduated with a business administration degree that few in his neighborhood believed possible. Now standing outside the towering glass headquarters of Barnes Global Holdings, he felt the weight of everything his parents had sacrificed resting on his shoulders. This company represented more than a job to him. It was his first real chance to step into a world he had only seen from a distance. Jonathan's first weeks at Barnes Global Holdings were filled with pressure, long hours, and quiet observation. As a junior analyst in the logistics division, his tasks were small but demanding: reviewing transport schedules, analyzing cost reports, and assisting senior managers in preparing strategy briefings. The corporate environment was far more complex than anything he had experienced before. Every meeting seemed like a battlefield of ideas where executives competed to prove their brilliance. Jonathan noticed quickly that some employees worked quietly and efficiently while others focused more on impressing superiors than solving real problems. One of the first colleagues he became close to was Daniel Brooks, an experienced operations coordinator known throughout the office for his honesty and sharp analytical mind. Daniel had spent years climbing through the company without much recognition, yet he remained loyal and hardworking. He took Jonathan under his wing, explaining unwritten rules about corporate politics and advising him to stay focused on learning rather than chasing attention. Meanwhile, Jonathan also noticed the presence of the company's celebrated CEO, Linda Churchill. She appeared occasionally on the upper floors surrounded by assistants and executives, projecting authority and confidence that made even experienced managers stand straighter when she walked past. Jonathan admired her leadership style and often wondered how someone could command such respect so effortlessly. What he did not know was that somewhere else in the building, the real owner of the company quietly observed the same corridors from a far more ordinary desk. Outside the office, Jonathan's life remained humble and disciplined. He rented a small apartment in Queens, shared weekend calls with his parents back in Detroit, and frequently visited his younger sister Olivia Price whenever she traveled to the city for nursing training programs. Olivia admired her older brother deeply and often reminded him not to lose the kindness that defined him growing up. Jonathan laughed at her warnings, promising that success would only allow him to help their family more. Yet even during those early months, subtle changes had already begun to shape his character. Recognition from managers fueled his confidence, and praise from colleagues made him hungry for greater achievements. He spent nights reviewing company reports, studying industry trends, and imagining himself one day leading entire departments rather than simply supporting them. Sometimes while walking past the elegant executive floors, he would pause briefly to glance through the glass walls at boardrooms where important decisions were made. Those rooms symbolized the future he wanted so desperately to reach. What Jonathan could never have imagined was that somewhere within the same building worked a quiet woman named Sabrina Barnes, who watched employees with careful attention and understood the company far better than anyone else there. Fate had already begun positioning their paths to cross, though neither of them yet realized how profoundly their lives would change once that moment arrived. The cafeteria at Barnes Global Holdings was busiest during lunchtime, when hundreds of employees from different departments poured in with trays, coffee cups, and brief moments of freedom from the rigid corporate atmosphere upstairs. One afternoon, Jonathan Price entered the cafeteria carrying a stack of documents he had been reviewing during the morning. His mind was still occupied with numbers and route schedules when he noticed a woman sitting alone near the window. She wore simple clothes, far more modest than most employees who tried to display corporate success through expensive outfits. What caught Jonathan's attention, however, was not her appearance but the way she studied a thick binder of operational reports with quiet focus. While others laughed loudly or scrolled through their phones, she was carefully marking notes in the margins, as though the information mattered deeply to her. Jonathan recognized the documents immediately. They were internal logistics reports usually reviewed only by senior managers. Curious and slightly amused, he walked over to the empty chair opposite her and politely asked if the seat was available. The woman looked up calmly and gave a small nod, her eyes thoughtful yet warm. "Of course," she said softly. "Plenty of space here." That simple moment marked the first time Jonathan Price and Sabrina Barnes sat across from each other without either realizing how significant their meeting would eventually become. Jonathan introduced himself casually, explaining that he worked in the logistics analysis department and had recently joined the company. Sabrina listened attentively, her expression reflecting genuine interest rather than polite formality. When he asked about the documents she was reviewing, Sabrina simply replied that she worked in operations and liked understanding how different parts of the company functioned together. Jonathan laughed lightly, saying most people tried to avoid those reports because they were filled with complicated shipment schedules and financial breakdowns. Sabrina smiled faintly at his comment, replying that sometimes the smallest details revealed the biggest truths about how a company treated its people. Her words intrigued Jonathan more than he expected. He found himself explaining some of the challenges he had encountered during his first weeks: delayed freight contracts, inefficient warehouse routing, and the constant pressure junior analysts faced from upper management. Sabrina asked thoughtful questions that made Jonathan realize she understood the systems far better than someone in an ordinary position might. Yet her tone remained humble, never once suggesting superiority. Around them the cafeteria buzzed with noise and conversation, but their discussion felt oddly calm and focused. By the time Jonathan finished his meal, he realized he had spoken more openly to this quiet colleague than he had with anyone else in the company. After that first conversation, their paths crossed again several times during the following weeks. Sometimes they met briefly near the elevator, other times in the cafeteria where their conversations gradually grew longer and more personal. Jonathan began sharing stories about his childhood in Detroit, describing how his father worked endless hours repairing engines and how his mother struggled to keep the grocery store running during difficult economic seasons. Sabrina listened with sincere attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed both empathy and curiosity about the world beyond corporate offices. She spoke less about her own life but mentioned that she valued simplicity and believed success should never come at the cost of integrity. Jonathan admired her perspective. In a workplace where many employees constantly competed for recognition, Sabrina seemed completely uninterested in appearances or praise. Her calm presence felt refreshing compared to the aggressive ambition surrounding them. What Jonathan did not know was that Sabrina carefully observed him during each interaction. She watched how he treated waitstaff in the cafeteria, how he spoke about his parents with pride, and how his determination to succeed carried both admirable strength and subtle vulnerability. For Sabrina, these early conversations were more than casual meetings. They were glimpses into Jonathan's true character, long before ambition and temptation would begin testing the man he hoped to become. In the months that followed their first meeting, Jonathan Price and Sabrina Barnes began to cross paths more frequently, sometimes by coincidence and sometimes by quiet intention. Their lunchtime conversations became something both of them looked forward to during the long workdays inside Barnes Global Holdings. Jonathan often arrived carrying spreadsheets or logistics reports, while Sabrina would already be seated by the window with a calm expression, reviewing operational notes. What began as small talk about work slowly expanded into deeper conversations about life, family, and personal struggles. Jonathan spoke openly about his childhood in Detroit, about how his father Michael had worked endless hours in a noisy garage to provide for the family, and how his mother Helen sacrificed comforts to keep their small grocery store alive during hard times. Sabrina listened carefully, often asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest. She rarely spoke about her own wealth or background, instead presenting herself simply as someone who valued honesty and humility. Jonathan admired that quality deeply. In a city where so many people chased status and luxury, Sabrina seemed different. She carried herself with quiet dignity and never tried to impress anyone. That authenticity slowly drew Jonathan closer to her, though neither of them yet called their growing bond by its true name. Outside the office, their friendship began extending into simple moments beyond corporate walls. Occasionally, Jonathan would suggest grabbing dinner after work at a modest neighborhood restaurant, far away from the polished executive districts where many colleagues socialized. Sabrina always agreed without hesitation, preferring small diners or quiet cafes rather than glamorous locations. During those evenings, Jonathan discovered more about the woman he was beginning to admire. Sabrina spoke about values she believed were important in both life and leadership: fairness, patience, and respect for people who worked quietly behind the scenes. She explained that power often revealed the worst in people if it was not balanced by humility. Jonathan found her views fascinating and different from the aggressive career advice he usually heard from ambitious coworkers. Sometimes they walked through Central Park after dinner, talking about the future and their dreams. Jonathan admitted that he hoped to climb the corporate ladder one day and build a life where his parents never had to worry about money again. Sabrina encouraged his ambition but reminded him that success should never make someone forget the struggles that shaped them. Her words stayed with Jonathan longer than he realized. As seasons changed and the city moved from autumn into winter, the connection between them grew stronger in quiet but meaningful ways. Their colleagues began noticing how often they appeared together during breaks or meetings, though neither Jonathan nor Sabrina paid much attention to office gossip. Jonathan felt a sense of calm whenever he was with her, a feeling he had rarely experienced during his relentless pursuit of success. Sabrina, on the other hand, watched Jonathan with a thoughtful mixture of affection and curiosity. She admired his determination and his loyalty toward his family, but she also sensed the powerful ambition inside him that could someday become dangerous if left unchecked. Still, she believed people deserved the chance to grow beyond their fears and insecurities. One snowy evening after work, as they stood outside the subway entrance saying goodbye, Jonathan hesitated before speaking. He told Sabrina that meeting her had changed the way he viewed the city and even his own life. Sabrina smiled softly at his words, her eyes reflecting warmth that went deeper than friendship. In that quiet moment beneath falling snow, neither of them formally declared love, yet both understood that something far more meaningful than friendship had already begun to take root between them. Late one evening, long after most employees had left the Barnes Global Holdings headquarters, Sabrina Barnes remained seated in a quiet conference room on the top executive floor. The lights of Manhattan glowed beyond the glass walls, reflecting against polished tables and the silent screens of presentation monitors. Across from her sat Linda Churchill, the woman the world believed to be the company's CEO. Linda had just finished a meeting with senior investors and still wore the composed expression she presented publicly, yet here, in private, her posture relaxed. Beside them was Victor Langston, the elderly board member who had served Sabrina's father faithfully for decades. He leaned on his cane as he studied the quarterly report spread across the table. The three of them spoke with a level of honesty impossible in the public boardroom. Victor warned that corporate competition was growing stronger and that investors expected decisive leadership. Linda responded with the confidence the public knew well, explaining how she had maintained the illusion of control while quietly implementing Sabrina's strategic decisions. Sabrina listened more than she spoke, carefully reviewing performance numbers and employee conduct reports she had collected during her weeks working anonymously within the company. What she had learned confirmed both her hopes and fears. Some leaders remained loyal to the values her father built, while others were already chasing influence and personal power. During that meeting, Linda reminded Sabrina that maintaining the secret structure required constant discipline. The outside world believed Linda Churchill was the rightful leader of Barnes Global Holdings, appearing in interviews, attending investor meetings, and negotiating large contracts. Only a handful of people knew the truth, that Sabrina Barnes held full ownership and final authority over the empire her father created. Ethan Walker, Sabrina's trusted legal advisor, had designed the legal framework that allowed this arrangement to function without suspicion. Through a complex network of shareholder agreements and holding structures, Sabrina's identity remained protected from public scrutiny. The purpose of the secret had never been about deception for personal gain. Instead, Sabrina wanted to observe how the company behaved when power appeared absent. She believed that leaders revealed their true character when they thought no one powerful was watching them. By working as an ordinary operations employee, she could witness the everyday reality of the organization, how supervisors treated junior staff, how managers handled pressure, and which individuals truly cared about the company's mission rather than their own advancement. Linda respected Sabrina's reasoning, though she often joked that carrying the public pressure of leadership felt like wearing armor every day. Before the meeting ended, Victor Langston spoke quietly but firmly about the future. He had known Arthur Barnes long enough to understand the weight of what Sabrina was trying to accomplish. The old man reminded both women that corporations rarely fell because of competition alone. More often they collapsed because ambition inside the organization slowly replaced integrity. Sabrina nodded thoughtfully, recalling the lessons her father had taught her years earlier about leadership. She explained that she wanted to identify the people within Barnes Global Holdings who truly deserved trust before revealing her identity. Those who remained ethical under ordinary circumstances would become the future backbone of the company. Those who abused small power would expose themselves long before she stepped forward publicly. As Sabrina gathered her notes and prepared to leave the building through the same employee entrance she used every day, she paused briefly at the window overlooking the city streets. Thousands of workers were returning home after long shifts across the city, each carrying their own dreams and struggles. Somewhere within the same building was Jonathan Price, the ambitious young analyst whose determination had caught her attention. Sabrina did not yet know how deeply his path would eventually intertwine with her own, but the quiet experiment she had begun was already setting the stage for consequences that no one in the company could foresee. The winter months brought intense pressure inside Barnes Global Holdings as the company faced a complicated logistical crisis that threatened one of its largest transportation contracts. A series of delivery delays had begun affecting multiple warehouses across the Northeast Corridor, and senior managers were struggling to determine where the breakdown was occurring. Meetings stretched for hours in conference rooms filled with frustrated executives reviewing shipment reports and cost projections. Jonathan Price, still a junior analyst at the time, had been assigned the routine task of reviewing transport data from several regional hubs. At first the assignment seemed ordinary, yet as he studied the numbers late one evening in the nearly empty office, Jonathan began noticing a pattern others had overlooked. Several routes were scheduled inefficiently, forcing delivery trucks to return half-empty while other routes were overloaded. The flawed routing structure was quietly draining millions in operational costs and causing the delays frustrating senior leadership. Jonathan worked through the night examining maps, delivery schedules, and fuel consumption reports until the solution finally appeared clear in his mind. By dawn, he had prepared a detailed restructuring proposal that reorganized distribution routes across 3 states, potentially saving the company enormous losses. The following morning, Jonathan nervously presented his findings to his direct supervisor and several department managers who had gathered for an emergency review session. At first, the room responded with skepticism, as executives were rarely accustomed to receiving strategic solutions from someone so junior in the organization. Yet as Jonathan calmly explained the inefficiencies and demonstrated how the proposed adjustments would reduce delivery times while lowering operational costs, the room slowly grew silent. Daniel Brooks, who had been quietly observing the presentation, realized Jonathan had uncovered a critical weakness that no senior analyst had detected. Within days, the proposal was tested on a limited scale across several warehouses, and the results were remarkable. Delivery delays dropped dramatically, fuel costs decreased, and the company avoided penalties tied to the failing contract. The success quickly reached the attention of senior leadership, including Linda Churchill, who reviewed the reports in the executive offices above. While the world believed Linda was making the final decisions, Sabrina Barnes quietly studied Jonathan's work behind the scenes. She recognized not only the brilliance of the solution but also the dedication that had led him to work overnight analyzing a problem others had dismissed. Through a discreet conversation with Linda, Sabrina approved Jonathan's promotion to a higher analyst position, though Jonathan himself would never know the true person responsible for that decision. Jonathan's sudden recognition inside the company changed the way many colleagues began viewing him. Managers who had barely noticed his presence before now invited him into strategic discussions, asking for his insight on logistics planning and regional operations. Daniel Brooks congratulated him warmly, reminding Jonathan that success often came from persistence rather than luck. That evening, Jonathan called his parents in Detroit to share the news, his voice filled with pride as he described how his work had helped solve a major corporate challenge. Michael Price listened quietly before telling his son that intelligence meant little without humility, a lesson he hoped Jonathan would remember as his career progressed. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the building, Sabrina Barnes quietly observed the ripple effect Jonathan's breakthrough had created. She admired the determination that had driven him to study the problem long after others had gone home, yet she also noticed the subtle shift in his confidence as praise began surrounding him. Ambition, she knew from experience, could be both a powerful strength and a dangerous weakness. For now, however, Jonathan Price had proven himself capable of something extraordinary, and the first step of his rising career within Barnes Global Holdings had officially begun. Jonathan Price's life began changing faster than he had ever imagined after his breakthrough at Barnes Global Holdings. His promotion brought not only increased responsibilities but also greater confidence in his future. Yet despite the growing pressure of his career, the one part of his life that continued bringing him calm and clarity was the time he spent with Sabrina Barnes. Their relationship had grown deeper over the months, shaped by countless conversations, quiet dinners, and evening walks through the city streets. Jonathan admired Sabrina's steady nature and her ability to remain grounded even when discussing difficult life topics. One evening, while they sat together in a small restaurant overlooking the Hudson River, Jonathan found himself reflecting on how much she had influenced his thinking. Her calm perspective balanced his ambitious drive, and her values reminded him of the lessons his parents had taught him growing up. In that moment, he realized something that had slowly grown within him for months: he could not imagine building his future without her beside him. Nervously, with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small ring box. It was not an extravagant ring, just a modest symbol he had purchased after weeks of saving carefully. Looking directly into Sabrina's eyes, he asked if she would marry him and share the life he was still trying to build. Sabrina was momentarily silent, her expression thoughtful as she looked at Jonathan holding the ring. For someone who secretly owned one of the most powerful companies in the region, the simplicity of the proposal felt surprisingly perfect. Jonathan's sincerity reminded her why she had grown to care for him deeply in the first place. She had watched him struggle through long nights at work, fight through doubt, and remain devoted to his family despite the pressures of his new career. What he lacked in wealth or prestige, he compensated for with determination and genuine emotion. After a quiet pause, Sabrina smiled softly and accepted his proposal. Jonathan's relief was immediate and joyful, and he promised her that their future together would be built on honesty and shared effort. When the news reached Jonathan's parents in Detroit, they were thrilled for their son. Michael Price spoke warmly about how proud he was that Jonathan had chosen a partner who valued humility rather than luxury. Sabrina met Jonathan's family shortly afterward, impressing them with her kindness and respectful nature. Olivia Price quickly became fond of Sabrina, often remarking that her brother had chosen someone far wiser than himself. The wedding itself surprised many people who expected something far more extravagant. Instead of a grand ceremony in a luxury venue, Sabrina insisted on a small, intimate gathering attended only by close friends and family members. The ceremony took place in a quiet botanical garden outside the city, where sunlight filtered gently through the trees and created a peaceful atmosphere. Linda Churchill attended quietly as Sabrina's cousin, careful not to attract unnecessary attention, while Ethan Walker and Victor Langston watched proudly from nearby seats. Jonathan's parents traveled from Detroit, overwhelmed by the joy of seeing their son reach such an important milestone. The simplicity of the celebration confused some of Jonathan's colleagues who had expected the rising corporate star to host an impressive event. Yet for Sabrina, the modest wedding represented exactly what she believed marriage should be: sincere, meaningful, and free from unnecessary spectacle. As Jonathan and Sabrina exchanged vows beneath the soft afternoon light, neither of them could have predicted the complicated future that awaited them inside the same company where their lives had first intersected. For now, however, the moment belonged entirely to them, a quiet promise of partnership that seemed destined to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. After their quiet wedding, Jonathan Price and Sabrina Barnes began their married life in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, far removed from the luxurious neighborhoods where many corporate executives preferred to live. Jonathan often wondered why Sabrina never seemed interested in extravagant homes or expensive cars, especially now that his career was beginning to gain attention within Barnes Global Holdings. Yet Sabrina always smiled whenever the topic arose, explaining that comfort and peace mattered more to her than status. Their apartment was simple but warm, filled with soft lighting, a small balcony overlooking a quiet street, and shelves stacked with books and notebooks where Sabrina recorded observations about life and work. In the evenings, Jonathan often returned home tired but energized by the progress he was making at the company. He would talk excitedly about new projects, meetings with senior managers, and the possibility of future promotions. Sabrina listened carefully each night, encouraging him while quietly asking thoughtful questions about how different departments treated their staff or handled difficult decisions. Jonathan believed she was simply curious about his career, never realizing that her questions often helped her understand how the company was evolving from within. At Barnes Global Holdings, Jonathan's responsibilities continued expanding as his reputation grew after solving the company's earlier logistics crisis. Managers began assigning him more complicated analyses and inviting him to strategy sessions where department leaders debated major operational changes. Daniel Brooks remained one of Jonathan's closest allies within the office, often reminding him that rising too quickly in the corporate hierarchy could attract both admiration and jealousy. Jonathan respected Daniel's advice but felt confident that his work ethic would protect him from office politics. Meanwhile, Sabrina continued performing her role as a mid-level operations employee with the same quiet professionalism she had shown since the beginning. Her coworkers often noticed how efficiently she handled complicated reports or how calmly she resolved conflicts between departments. Grace Morgan from Human Resources had quietly developed a deep respect for Sabrina's work ethic, though she never suspected the extraordinary truth about the woman sitting among ordinary employees. Occasionally, Sabrina would attend meetings where Jonathan presented new proposals, carefully observing how he handled authority as his influence slowly expanded. She admired his intelligence and determination but also noticed subtle shifts in his personality. Praise from senior executives was beginning to shape his confidence in ways that reminded her of the corporate arrogance her father had warned about years earlier. Outside the office, Jonathan and Sabrina maintained a peaceful rhythm of daily life that seemed almost disconnected from the intense corporate environment where they both worked. Weekends were often spent visiting Jonathan's sister Olivia whenever she traveled to New York for hospital training programs, or sharing long dinners with Daniel Brooks and a few trusted colleagues who valued genuine friendship over professional competition. Sabrina enjoyed these gatherings because they revealed the personal side of people who often appeared rigid and calculating during office hours. Jonathan, however, sometimes found himself thinking increasingly about the future he wanted to achieve. He imagined climbing higher within Barnes Global Holdings, perhaps even reaching executive leadership one day. Each new opportunity fueled his ambition further, reinforcing the belief that he was destined for something greater than his humble beginnings. Sabrina listened quietly whenever he shared these dreams, her expression warm but thoughtful. Deep inside she understood that ambition, if left unchecked, could change even the most sincere hearts. Yet she chose not to interfere with Jonathan's path. Instead, she continued watching patiently, knowing that time would reveal the true direction of the man she had chosen to love. The calm rhythm inside Barnes Global Holdings began shifting the morning Rachel Hogan walked into the headquarters building for the first time. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. Tall, confident, and sharply dressed in a way that suggested calculated ambition rather than simple elegance, Rachel carried herself with the kind of presence that immediately drew attention. She had previously built a strong reputation in corporate sales across several major firms in Chicago and Boston, known for securing high-value contracts and negotiating deals with an almost fearless charm. Her professional record impressed the executive committee, and Linda Churchill approved her recruitment as a senior executive in strategic partnerships. That morning many employees paused briefly when Rachel crossed the open office floor, her confident smile and direct eye contact making it clear that she understood the influence appearance could hold in corporate culture. Daniel Brooks quietly observed the scene from his desk and later remarked to Jonathan that Rachel Hogan looked like someone who intended to climb quickly. Jonathan laughed lightly at the comment, believing that ambition alone did not guarantee success in a company built on discipline and structure. Yet even in those first moments, Rachel's arrival had already introduced a new energy into the building, an energy that would soon begin reshaping several lives within the company. Rachel quickly demonstrated that her reputation for intelligence was not exaggerated. Within her first weeks, she studied the company's strategic partnerships with remarkable intensity, reviewing past contracts and identifying potential opportunities for expansion. She spoke confidently during meetings, often presenting bold ideas that impressed certain executives while making more cautious managers slightly uneasy. Her natural charisma allowed her to navigate the complex personalities of corporate leadership with surprising ease. During one particular strategy session involving logistics and distribution partnerships, Rachel encountered Jonathan Price for the first time. Jonathan had been invited to present updated analysis reports based on his earlier success within the logistics department. As he spoke, Rachel listened carefully, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed she understood the operational side of the company far better than most sales executives. Jonathan appreciated the intellectual challenge of her questions and responded with clear explanations. When the meeting ended, Rachel approached him directly, complimenting the clarity of his analysis and suggesting they might collaborate on future projects. Jonathan welcomed the idea enthusiastically, seeing it as another opportunity to expand his influence inside the company. From that moment forward, their professional paths began crossing more frequently, though neither of them fully understood the consequences those collaborations would eventually bring. While many employees admired Rachel's confidence, Sabrina Barnes watched her with a more cautious perspective. From her desk in operations, Sabrina quietly observed the subtle dynamics unfolding around the new executive. Rachel possessed a remarkable ability to adapt her personality depending on who she spoke with, warm and friendly toward junior staff when necessary, yet assertive and persuasive in meetings with senior leaders. Sabrina noticed how Rachel studied people carefully, almost as if measuring which individuals could be useful for her advancement. One afternoon Sabrina happened to pass by the conference room where Jonathan and Rachel were discussing a partnership proposal. Through the glass wall she saw Jonathan speaking with growing excitement as Rachel leaned forward attentively, her expression encouraging his ideas. Sabrina felt a faint unease she could not immediately explain. Jonathan had always been ambitious, but something about Rachel's presence seemed to amplify that ambition in ways that felt unfamiliar. Still, Sabrina reminded herself that business relationships often evolved naturally in competitive environments. For now she chose to remain silent, continuing her quiet observation of the company from within. Yet deep inside she sensed that Rachel Hogan's arrival had introduced a new and unpredictable force into Barnes Global Holdings, one capable of changing far more than corporate strategy. Rachel Hogan wasted no time positioning herself at the center of several strategic initiatives within Barnes Global Holdings. Her office soon became a place where ambitious proposals were drafted and ambitious people gathered. One of the projects she focused on involved expanding the company's regional freight partnerships, a complicated initiative that required both logistical expertise and strong negotiation strategy. Rachel knew exactly who she needed to involve: Jonathan Price. She began inviting him to collaborate on reports, praising his analytical abilities in front of senior managers and occasionally asking for his opinions during executive meetings. Jonathan appreciated the attention and began spending more time working closely with Rachel on presentations and financial projections. Their meetings often extended into late evenings as they reviewed contracts and logistics charts together. Rachel's sharp mind and confident personality made their collaboration efficient and exciting, and Jonathan felt proud that someone with such influence recognized his talent. To him it appeared to be the natural progression of his growing career, but Rachel understood something deeper. By encouraging his ambition and praising his intelligence, she was slowly drawing Jonathan into a circle where admiration could easily blur the lines between professional respect and personal temptation. As the weeks passed, their professional relationship gradually became more personal. Rachel often suggested informal discussions outside the office to refine strategy ideas, choosing quiet restaurants or lounges where business conversations could continue without interruption. Jonathan initially believed these meetings were purely work-related, but he began noticing how easily Rachel guided conversations toward personal topics: his childhood in Detroit, his dreams for the future, his frustrations with corporate politics. Rachel listened attentively, occasionally complimenting his determination and telling him he deserved far greater recognition within the company. Jonathan, who had spent years fighting to prove himself, found those words both flattering and motivating. At the office, Daniel Brooks started observing the increasing closeness between the two colleagues. Daniel respected Jonathan deeply but sensed that Rachel possessed a calculated charm capable of influencing even strong personalities. One evening Daniel warned Jonathan casually that corporate environments were filled with alliances that often carried hidden consequences. Jonathan dismissed the concern with a confident laugh, insisting that their collaboration was strictly professional. Yet Daniel remained uneasy, quietly watching the situation unfold while hoping his friend's growing ambition would not lead him into unnecessary trouble. Meanwhile, Sabrina Barnes noticed the same shift from a very different perspective. From her position in operations, she saw how often Jonathan now worked alongside Rachel during strategic meetings and late-night project sessions. The change in Jonathan's behavior was subtle but unmistakable. He seemed more energized by praise from executives and increasingly eager to prove himself in front of Rachel, whose approval carried growing influence among senior leadership. Sabrina did not immediately suspect betrayal, but she recognized the early signs of a dangerous pattern. Ambition, admiration, and proximity could create emotional confusion even in people who began with honest intentions. One evening, as Sabrina reviewed operational reports alone in the quiet office, she paused when she saw Jonathan and Rachel leaving the building together after another long meeting. They were laughing lightly, discussing something animatedly as they stepped into the elevator. Sabrina closed the report slowly and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. She trusted Jonathan, yet she also understood human nature better than most. The seeds of temptation, once planted, could grow quietly beneath the surface long before anyone realized the damage they might eventually cause. As the months passed, Jonathan Price's influence inside Barnes Global Holdings continued expanding at a pace that surprised even some senior executives. His earlier logistics breakthrough had already earned him respect, but now his collaboration with Rachel Hogan placed him in rooms where strategic decisions were made. Rachel frequently praised Jonathan during leadership discussions, highlighting his analytical abilities and presenting him as a key contributor to several successful partnership proposals. Linda Churchill, acting as the public CEO, reviewed the reports and approved Jonathan's promotion to a higher managerial position overseeing regional logistics coordination. The announcement created a wave of attention throughout the company. Some employees congratulated Jonathan sincerely, recognizing his hard work and dedication, while others quietly whispered about how quickly he seemed to be rising through the ranks. Jonathan accepted the promotion with visible pride, believing he had finally begun achieving the success he had worked toward since leaving Detroit. Yet as his responsibilities increased, so did the subtle change in his mindset. The once humble analyst now walked through the office with greater confidence, his voice carrying more authority during meetings, and his ambitions growing stronger with every new opportunity placed before him. Rachel Hogan watched Jonathan's transformation with careful satisfaction. She understood the psychology of ambition better than most people in the corporate world. By consistently praising Jonathan's intelligence and encouraging his ideas during executive discussions, she had slowly built his confidence while also strengthening her own influence within the company. Their collaboration became widely recognized, and many employees began referring to them as an effective strategic duo. Rachel often invited Jonathan to help present proposals to senior leadership, giving him the spotlight during important meetings while she subtly guided the direction of the conversation. Jonathan admired her strategic thinking and often credited her for helping him navigate the complex politics of corporate leadership. What he did not fully realize was that Rachel carefully shaped each opportunity to deepen his reliance on her support. Outside the office, their professional discussions occasionally extended into dinners where they continued refining strategy ideas. Jonathan still believed these meetings were purely work-related, but Rachel's warm laughter and constant admiration gradually blurred the boundaries between partnership and personal connection. For Rachel, every step forward strengthened her position within Barnes Global Holdings, and Jonathan Price was becoming the perfect ally to accelerate her rise. While Jonathan's career soared upward, Sabrina Barnes continued observing the situation with quiet patience. From her operations desk, she saw the growing admiration Jonathan received from colleagues and the increasing confidence in his behavior during meetings. She felt proud of his achievements because she knew how hard he had worked to reach this point. Yet at the same time, she sensed that the environment around him was beginning to influence his character. Ambition had always been part of Jonathan's personality, but now it seemed to be evolving into something sharper, more driven by recognition than by purpose. Sabrina also noticed how frequently Rachel Hogan appeared beside him during important presentations, often smiling approvingly whenever Jonathan spoke. Sabrina never interfered with Jonathan's professional growth, believing that true character could only reveal itself through genuine choices rather than forced guidance. Still, a quiet concern lingered in her mind as she reviewed internal reports late at night. She remembered her father's warning that success could sometimes test a person more severely than failure. As Jonathan stepped deeper into the powerful world of corporate leadership, Sabrina wondered whether the man she had married would remain the same person who once shared simple dinners and spoke humbly about his dreams. The transformation in Jonathan Price's life did not happen overnight, but by the time the company entered its next fiscal quarter, the distance between his old self and the person he was becoming had begun to widen. Long meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and constant praise from senior executives had created an environment where ambition ruled every decision. Rachel Hogan remained constantly beside him through these changes, offering encouragement that often sounded like admiration. She frequently told Jonathan that his intelligence and leadership qualities were far greater than the position he currently held. Those compliments fed the quiet hunger inside Jonathan that had always pushed him to escape the struggles of his childhood. Rachel knew exactly how to phrase her words so they sounded supportive rather than manipulative. One evening after a lengthy strategy meeting, the two of them remained in the executive conference room reviewing documents long after most employees had gone home. The quiet building created an unusual atmosphere where professional discussions slowly turned personal. Rachel spoke openly about how lonely success could feel, describing how ambitious people often sacrificed genuine relationships while chasing recognition. Jonathan listened carefully, realizing he had rarely spoken about his own fears and pressures with anyone outside his family. That night marked the first moment their relationship began crossing invisible boundaries neither of them openly acknowledged. Their interactions soon became more personal and emotionally complicated. Rachel began suggesting private dinners to celebrate successful deals or major strategic victories, framing these invitations as harmless opportunities to discuss upcoming projects. Jonathan accepted each invitation without much hesitation, convincing himself that his growing influence in the company required stronger professional connections. Yet during those evenings, conversations often shifted away from business matters. Rachel spoke about the loneliness of corporate leadership, about how people in powerful positions often struggled to find genuine understanding from those around them. Jonathan, exhausted from the pressure of his expanding responsibilities, found comfort in those conversations. Rachel's confidence and admiration made him feel valued in ways that felt intoxicating. The emotional connection between them deepened quietly, until one evening their conversation lingered long enough for the tension between them to become impossible to ignore. That moment, born from ambition, loneliness, and temptation, led them into a secret relationship neither of them intended to reveal publicly. Jonathan knew he was crossing a line that could damage his marriage, yet he justified the situation to himself by believing he deserved happiness and admiration beyond the ordinary life he had built with Sabrina. Sabrina Barnes sensed the change in Jonathan long before she fully understood its cause. His late nights at the office became more frequent, and his conversations at home grew shorter and more distracted. Sometimes he returned from work with unusual excitement, speaking about strategic opportunities and Rachel's impressive negotiation skills during meetings. Sabrina listened quietly without interrupting, observing the subtle ways Jonathan's behavior had shifted. She noticed how he spoke about Rachel more often than any other colleague, describing her as brilliant, confident, and indispensable to the company's future. Sabrina never confronted him directly because she believed accusations without proof would only damage trust further. Instead, she watched carefully, analyzing small details with the same calm observation she applied to corporate decisions. Late one evening, while reviewing operational reports alone at her desk, Sabrina realized that Jonathan and Rachel had once again left the building together hours earlier. The realization did not trigger anger, but it stirred a quiet sadness deep within her. Sabrina understood that ambition had begun pulling Jonathan into a world where admiration and temptation often blurred moral boundaries. What she did not yet know was how far that path would lead him, or how dramatically the truth would eventually reshape every life involved. Rachel Hogan's influence inside Barnes Global Holdings had grown remarkably within a short period, and much of that rise was closely connected to Jonathan Price's increasing authority. By this stage, Jonathan had gained the trust of several department heads due to his analytical brilliance and his involvement in successful logistics restructuring projects. Rachel recognized that Jonathan's voice carried growing weight during internal decision-making discussions. Carefully and strategically, she began encouraging him to support a proposal that would elevate her position within the company. During private conversations, Rachel spoke confidently about how the company needed stronger leadership in strategic operations to remain competitive in the rapidly changing logistics market. She suggested that if someone with her experience were placed in a higher executive position, the company could expand partnerships, strengthen negotiation power, and secure long-term contracts that would dramatically increase revenue. Jonathan believed her arguments made sense and felt proud that she trusted him enough to discuss such major ambitions. In his mind, recommending Rachel for promotion would simply be supporting a talented colleague whose contributions deserved recognition. The proposal eventually reached the senior leadership review meeting where department heads and executive advisors gathered to evaluate the idea. Jonathan presented Rachel's achievements with impressive enthusiasm, highlighting the contracts she had secured and the strategic insights she had contributed to several company initiatives. Some executives nodded in agreement, acknowledging that Rachel had indeed brought strong negotiation skills into the organization. However, not everyone in the room felt comfortable with the speed of her rise. Grace Morgan from Human Resources raised a thoughtful concern, explaining that executive promotions required careful evaluation of leadership behavior and long-term company values, not just immediate business results. She reminded the group that Barnes Global Holdings had always prioritized integrity and internal trust when selecting high-ranking leaders. Jonathan responded confidently, arguing that Rachel represented exactly the kind of dynamic leadership the company needed for its next phase of growth. His argument carried persuasive strength, and because his reputation inside the company had grown significantly, many decision-makers accepted his recommendation. Shortly afterward, Linda Churchill approved the promotion announcement that would officially name Rachel Hogan as Vice President of Strategic Operations. The announcement spread through the company like a wave of mixed reactions. Some employees congratulated Rachel enthusiastically, impressed by her rapid climb into executive leadership. Others whispered quietly about how quickly she had gained influence and whether Jonathan's support had played too large a role in the decision. Daniel Brooks felt a quiet discomfort when he heard the news, sensing that the balance of power within the company was beginning to shift in complicated ways. Meanwhile, Sabrina Barnes received the report of the promotion through the internal management summaries she reviewed daily. Her reaction remained calm and thoughtful rather than emotional. Sabrina had watched Rachel's rise carefully and already suspected that ambition was driving more than simple professional achievement. Still, she allowed the promotion to stand because she believed every person eventually revealed their true character when given authority. Power had a way of exposing intentions that words often concealed. As Sabrina closed the report and looked out across the busy office floor, she understood that Rachel Hogan had just gained a position that would give her enormous influence within Barnes Global Holdings. What Rachel did not know was that the quiet woman working only a few floors below still controlled the entire empire, and was watching every move with patient attention. Rachel Hogan's promotion to Vice President of Strategic Operations changed the atmosphere inside Barnes Global Holdings almost immediately. Her new authority allowed her to oversee major partnership negotiations, supply chain contracts, and vendor agreements that involved millions of dollars in company funds. To most employees, the change seemed like a natural progression for a rising executive, but Sabrina Barnes noticed something different while reviewing internal operational summaries. Certain contract approvals appeared unusually rushed, and some of the companies receiving large partnership deals had very little history working with Barnes Global Holdings. Sabrina's instincts, sharpened by years of studying corporate behavior under her father's guidance, quietly signaled that something beneath the surface might be unfolding. Rather than reacting emotionally, she chose to examine the situation carefully. That evening she contacted Ethan Walker, the trusted legal advisor who had helped her structure the hidden ownership arrangement years earlier. Ethan had always been methodical and discreet, exactly the type of ally Sabrina needed when sensitive issues required investigation. When Sabrina explained the unusual contract patterns she had discovered, Ethan agreed that the situation deserved closer attention before any public action was taken. Within days, Ethan Walker and Victor Langston began reviewing the company's recent contract activity with careful precision. Victor, though elderly, possessed decades of experience in corporate governance and remained fiercely loyal to the Barnes family legacy. The two men quietly analyzed financial approvals, vendor histories, and the internal authorization process surrounding Rachel's recent deals. What they discovered raised serious concerns. Several of the contracts Rachel had negotiated involved third-party companies connected to individuals with questionable business reputations. While nothing appeared illegal on the surface, the agreements placed Barnes Global Holdings in financially risky arrangements that could benefit external parties more than the company itself. Ethan explained that such strategies were often used by ambitious executives seeking quick results to strengthen their personal influence. Sabrina listened patiently to their findings during a private meeting held late in the evening at her apartment. She did not immediately accuse Rachel of wrongdoing because the evidence required deeper confirmation. Instead, she instructed Ethan to continue monitoring the transactions discreetly while Victor kept watch over board-level approvals. Sabrina believed strongly that truth should always be revealed through facts rather than assumptions. Meanwhile, inside the company, Rachel continued expanding her influence with remarkable confidence. Her presence in executive meetings grew stronger, and she often spoke about future expansion plans with an air of certainty that impressed many senior managers. Jonathan Price remained one of her closest professional allies, frequently supporting her proposals during strategic discussions. To Jonathan, Rachel's bold decisions represented the aggressive leadership needed to push the company toward greater success. Daniel Brooks, however, had begun noticing subtle irregularities in some of the operational decisions linked to Rachel's projects. He mentioned his concerns quietly to Grace Morgan, the HR director, who advised him to document any unusual activity before drawing conclusions. As these quiet observations unfolded across different corners of the company, Sabrina continued working at her ordinary operations desk like any other employee. Few people realized that behind the calm expression she carried every day, she was slowly assembling a full picture of what Rachel Hogan was truly doing inside Barnes Global Holdings. The investigation had begun silently, and its eventual revelations would shake the entire corporate structure far more than anyone expected. As Rachel Hogan settled comfortably into her powerful position as Vice President of Strategic Operations, her confidence grew stronger with every passing week. Her office on the executive floor became a center of influence where managers frequently sought approval for major decisions. Jonathan Price remained one of the few people she trusted to speak with openly about strategy and corporate politics. During one late evening conversation in her office, Rachel shifted the discussion from company projects to something far more personal. With calculated calm, she mentioned that Jonathan's reputation in the company was growing rapidly and that many executives now viewed him as a future leader. However, she added that appearances mattered in corporate environments, and sometimes personal associations could affect how influential leaders were perceived. Jonathan initially laughed at the remark, unsure what she was implying. Rachel leaned forward slightly and explained that some employees had begun whispering about Jonathan's wife working as an ordinary operations staff member in the same company where he now held growing authority. In Rachel's view, such a situation could damage the professional image Jonathan was building among senior executives. Her tone remained gentle but persuasive, suggesting that ambitious leaders sometimes needed to make difficult decisions for the sake of their careers. Jonathan did not immediately respond, but Rachel's words stayed in his mind long after the conversation ended. Over the following days, he began noticing small moments that seemed to support her argument. During executive meetings, some managers joked lightly about the unusual situation of a rising corporate leader whose spouse worked quietly in a lower department of the same organization. Though the comments were not cruel, they made Jonathan increasingly self-conscious. His ambition, which had always been fueled by the desire to escape the limitations of his childhood, now began shaping his thinking in dangerous ways. Rachel continued reinforcing the idea gently whenever they spoke, reminding him that leadership often required separating personal relationships from professional environments. She suggested that Sabrina might be happier working somewhere else where she would not constantly be compared to her husband's growing success. Jonathan wrestled internally with the suggestion, remembering the woman who had supported him during his earliest struggles. Yet ambition clouded his judgment. Instead of confronting the emotional complexity of the situation honestly, he gradually convinced himself that Rachel's advice was practical rather than manipulative. Late one evening, Jonathan sat alone in his office reviewing company restructuring plans when the decision finally formed in his mind. The proposal for departmental reorganization included reducing certain operational positions that were considered non-essential under the new management structure Rachel had proposed. Sabrina's department appeared on the list. Jonathan stared at the document for several minutes, feeling a quiet tension in his chest. Part of him knew that removing Sabrina from the company would hurt her deeply, but another voice inside his mind argued that such sacrifices were sometimes necessary for professional advancement. Rachel's words echoed again: leadership required difficult choices. With a heavy but determined hand, Jonathan approved the restructuring plan and scheduled a meeting to implement the changes. What he did not realize was that the woman he had just decided to remove from the company was the very person who secretly owned every office, every department, and every executive seat within Barnes Global Holdings. The cruel decision had been made, and the consequences waiting ahead were far greater than Jonathan could possibly imagine. The restructuring meeting was scheduled for a quiet Thursday morning inside one of the executive conference rooms at Barnes Global Holdings. Several department supervisors gathered around the long polished table while Jonathan Price stood confidently at the front, presenting the new operational changes that were supposed to increase efficiency across the organization. Rachel Hogan sat comfortably beside him, her expression calm and supportive as if she were witnessing the natural progression of corporate leadership. Employees whose departments were affected had been invited to attend so they could hear the decisions directly from management. Among them was Sabrina Barnes, who entered the room wearing her usual modest outfit and carrying a small notebook like any ordinary operations employee. She took her seat without drawing attention, listening quietly while Jonathan explained how certain roles were being eliminated as part of the restructuring strategy. Many employees appeared nervous as they waited for the final announcements. The atmosphere in the room felt tense and heavy, yet Jonathan continued speaking with an authority he had grown accustomed to during his recent promotions. When the time came to address the affected positions, Jonathan read through the list with professional detachment. Sabrina's department was among those marked for reduction, and several operational staff members realized their roles were being dissolved. Finally, Jonathan paused briefly before mentioning Sabrina's name directly. His voice remained steady as he explained that her position had been identified as non-essential within the new company structure and would therefore be terminated effective immediately. A quiet murmur spread through the room as several colleagues glanced toward Sabrina in disbelief. Some employees, including Daniel Brooks and Grace Morgan, looked visibly uncomfortable with the decision. Grace especially knew Sabrina to be one of the most reliable and efficient workers in operations, making the explanation feel unusually forced. Sabrina herself remained calm, her expression composed as she looked toward Jonathan without anger or protest. Rachel watched the moment closely from her seat beside Jonathan, satisfied that the plan she had carefully planted in Jonathan's mind had finally been executed. After the meeting ended, employees slowly left the room while whispers filled the hallway outside. Daniel Brooks approached Jonathan privately, questioning whether the decision had been truly necessary. Jonathan insisted that the restructuring plan had been carefully evaluated and approved through executive channels. Meanwhile, Sabrina quietly gathered her belongings from her desk without creating a scene. She spoke politely with coworkers who expressed sympathy, thanking them for their kindness and wishing them well in their work. No one in the building suspected that the woman leaving the office that afternoon was the true owner of Barnes Global Holdings. Sabrina stepped outside the building into the cool afternoon air, her thoughts steady rather than emotional. She had allowed the situation to unfold because she wanted the truth about Jonathan and Rachel to reveal itself fully. As she walked away from the headquarters that she secretly controlled, Sabrina understood that the next chapter of events would expose far more than a simple act of betrayal. The moment Jonathan Price fired his own wife had unknowingly triggered consequences that would soon shake the entire company. 3 days after the restructuring meeting, a formal notice circulated through the executive offices of Barnes Global Holdings announcing an urgent board meeting requested by CEO Linda Churchill. The message surprised many senior managers because such meetings were usually scheduled weeks in advance. Jonathan Price, however, interpreted the invitation as a positive sign. With Rachel Hogan now firmly positioned as vice president and his own authority growing rapidly, Jonathan believed the meeting might involve new strategic opportunities or perhaps recognition for the restructuring plan he had recently implemented. That morning he entered the headquarters building with a sense of pride, greeting colleagues with the confidence of someone who believed his career was entering its most powerful stage. Rachel arrived shortly afterward, elegant and composed as always, whispering that the board probably wanted to discuss future expansion strategies. Neither of them showed the slightest concern as they stepped into the elevator leading to the executive boardroom floor. Inside the large conference room, several influential figures were already seated, including Victor Langston, Ethan Walker, and other long-standing board members who rarely appeared together except during major decisions. Jonathan noticed that the atmosphere in the room felt unusually serious, but he assumed it was simply the gravity of corporate planning. A few minutes later, Linda Churchill entered the boardroom, her presence commanding immediate attention as she took her seat at the head of the table. She greeted the executives briefly before announcing that the meeting involved an important matter concerning the company's leadership and governance structure. Jonathan listened carefully, expecting to hear discussion about strategic plans or operational restructuring. Instead, Linda paused and turned her gaze toward the closed door behind the boardroom table. "Before we begin," she said calmly, "there is someone whose presence is required for this discussion." The door slowly opened, and Sabrina Barnes walked into the room with quiet confidence. Jonathan felt a brief moment of confusion, wondering why his wife had been invited to a board meeting reserved only for top executives. Rachel frowned slightly, equally puzzled by the unexpected appearance. Sabrina stepped forward and stood beside Linda without saying anything. The silence in the room deepened as Victor Langston rose slowly from his chair and addressed everyone present. In a steady voice, he explained that many people in the company had misunderstood the true leadership structure of Barnes Global Holdings for several years. Victor then revealed the truth that no one except a small circle of trusted individuals had ever known. He explained that while Linda Churchill had served publicly as CEO, the true owner and controlling authority of the entire corporation was Sabrina Barnes, daughter of the company's founder Arthur Barnes. The arrangement had been created years earlier after Arthur's death, allowing Sabrina to observe the company from within without revealing her identity. The boardroom fell into stunned silence as the revelation settled into the minds of those present. Jonathan's face drained of color as he slowly turned to look at Sabrina, struggling to understand the meaning of what he had just heard. Rachel sat motionless, realizing that the situation she believed she had controlled had suddenly collapsed beyond her imagination. Sabrina spoke calmly for the first time, explaining that she had allowed events to unfold so she could see the true character of the people working within her father's company. Her voice carried neither anger nor emotion, only quiet authority. At that moment, Jonathan finally understood the unimaginable truth. He had publicly fired the woman who secretly owned the entire company and had quietly supported his career from the beginning. The consequences of his actions had just become impossible to escape. The silence inside the boardroom after the revelation felt heavier than any argument that could have filled the space. Jonathan Price remained frozen in his chair, his mind racing through every memory of the past few years with painful clarity. The woman he had married, the quiet operations employee he believed he had supported through modest living, the colleague he had publicly dismissed during the restructuring meeting, she had been the true owner of Barnes Global Holdings all along. His career, his promotions, the opportunities he had proudly claimed as personal achievements were suddenly revealed in a completely different light. Across the table, Rachel Hogan looked equally stunned, her confident composure slowly fading as the weight of the situation became clear. Sabrina Barnes stood calmly beside Linda Churchill, her posture steady and dignified as if she had expected this moment long before it arrived. Jonathan attempted to speak, but no explanation could form properly in his mind. For the first time since his career began rising inside the company, he felt a deep sense of helplessness replacing the confidence he once carried. Ethan Walker then presented the findings from the investigation he and Victor Langston had been conducting over the past several weeks. Detailed reports were placed before the board members, outlining suspicious contracts Rachel Hogan had approved shortly after her promotion to Vice President of Strategic Operations. Several of the agreements involved third-party companies linked to individuals with questionable financial histories. While the arrangements had been structured carefully enough to avoid immediate legal violations, they clearly placed Barnes Global Holdings at unnecessary financial risk. Jonathan watched the evidence unfold with growing disbelief, realizing that many of the proposals he had supported in recent meetings had been designed primarily to strengthen Rachel's personal influence rather than benefit the company itself. Rachel attempted to defend her decisions, arguing that aggressive expansion sometimes required bold financial strategies. However, Ethan calmly explained that multiple documents revealed hidden connections between Rachel and several of. Room deepened as Victor Langston rose slowly from his chair and addressed everyone present. In a steady voice he explained that many people in the company had misunderstood the true leadership structure of Barnes Global Holdings for several years. Victor then revealed the truth that no one except a small circle of trusted individuals had ever known. He explained that while Linda Churchill had served publicly as CEO, the true owner and controlling authority of the entire corporation was Sabrina Barnes, daughter of the company's founder Arthur Barnes. The arrangement had been created years earlier after Arthur's death, allowing Sabrina to observe the company from within without revealing her identity. The boardroom fell into stunned silence as the revelation settled into the minds of those present. Jonathan's face drained of color as he slowly turned to look at Sabrina, struggling to understand the meaning of what he had just heard. Rachel sat motionless, realizing that the situation she believed she had controlled had suddenly collapsed beyond her imagination. Sabrina spoke calmly for the first time, explaining that she had allowed events to unfold so she could see the true character of the people working within her father's company. Her voice carried neither anger nor emotion, only quiet authority. At that moment Jonathan finally understood the unimaginable truth. He had publicly fired the woman who secretly owned the entire company and had quietly supported his career from the beginning. The consequences of his actions had just become impossible to escape. The silence inside the boardroom after the revelation felt heavier than any argument that could have filled the space. Jonathan Price remained frozen in his chair, his mind racing through every memory of the past few years with painful clarity. The woman he had married, the quiet operations employee he believed he had supported through modest living, the colleague he had publicly dismissed during the restructuring meeting, she had been the true owner of Barnes Global Holdings all along. His career, his promotions, the opportunities he had proudly claimed as personal achievements were suddenly revealed in a completely different light. Across the table Rachel Hogan looked equally stunned, her confident composure slowly fading as the weight of the situation became clear. Sabrina Barnes stood calmly beside Linda Churchill, her posture steady and dignified as if she had expected this moment long before it arrived. Jonathan attempted to speak, but no explanation could form properly in his mind. For the first time since his career began rising inside the company, he felt a deep sense of helplessness replacing the confidence he once carried. Ethan Walker then presented the findings from the investigation he and Victor Langston had been conducting over the past several weeks. Detailed reports were placed before the board members, outlining suspicious contracts Rachel Hogan had approved shortly after her promotion to Vice President of Strategic Operations. Several of the agreements involved third-party companies linked to individuals with questionable financial histories. While the arrangements had been structured carefully enough to avoid immediate legal violations, they clearly placed Barnes Global Holdings at unnecessary financial risk. Jonathan watched the evidence unfold with growing disbelief, realizing that many of the proposals he had supported in recent meetings had been designed primarily to strengthen Rachel's personal influence rather than benefit the company itself. Rachel attempted to defend her decisions, arguing that aggressive expansion sometimes required bold financial strategies. However, Ethan calmly explained that multiple documents revealed hidden connections between Rachel and several of the contractors involved. Those relationships had never been disclosed to the board, violating company transparency policies and corporate ethics guidelines that Arthur Barnes himself had established decades earlier. The board members quickly reached a unanimous decision. Jonathan Price was immediately removed from his managerial position for gross misconduct and abuse of authority, including the wrongful termination of an employee without proper review, a decision that had ironically targeted the company's true owner. Rachel Hogan was stripped of her executive title and suspended pending further legal review of the contract she had approved. Daniel Brooks and Grace Morgan, who had quietly documented several of the irregular decisions over recent weeks, were asked to assist in reorganizing the departments affected by the failed restructuring plan. Jonathan sat silently as the consequences unfolded around him, the career he had worked so hard to build collapsing within a single meeting. When the session ended, he remained seated while others slowly left the boardroom. Sabrina paused briefly before walking toward the door, her expression calm yet distant. Jonathan wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything, but the truth had already spoken louder than words ever could. The ambition that once fueled his rise had now delivered its final and devastating cost. The days following the dramatic boardroom revelation were filled with turbulence inside Barnes Global Holdings. News of the sudden leadership shakeup spread quickly through corporate circles, though the company handled public communication carefully to avoid unnecessary scandal. Internally, however, employees were still absorbing the astonishing truth that the quiet operations staff member they had known as Sabrina was actually the true owner of the entire corporation. Many workers felt a mixture of admiration and shock, realizing that she had spent years observing the company from within while protecting its values. Daniel Brooks and Grace Morgan were temporarily assigned greater responsibilities as they helped stabilize operations and restore order after the disruption caused by Rachel's contracts and Jonathan's restructuring decisions. Meanwhile, Sabrina remained calm and methodical, guiding the board through a recovery strategy designed to protect employees and repair any damage to the company's reputation. She made it clear that the organization would continue operating with integrity, exactly as her father Arthur Barnes had always intended. Rachel Hogan's carefully constructed network of influence collapsed far more quickly than it had formed. Investigators reviewing the questionable contracts soon discovered deeper connections between Rachel and a businessman named Marcus Steele, a figure known in corporate finance circles for operating through aggressive and ethically questionable partnerships. Marcus had quietly supported Rachel's rise within Barnes Global Holdings because the contracts she approved would have allowed his companies to gain enormous financial advantages. Once the investigation began attracting legal attention, Marcus distanced himself immediately, leaving Rachel to face the consequences alone. The authorities began reviewing the agreements for possible financial misconduct, and Rachel's once glamorous corporate reputation disintegrated almost overnight. Former allies who had admired her confidence now avoided association with her entirely. For someone who had built her career on manipulation and calculated charm, the sudden loss of power and protection was a devastating reversal. Jonathan Price faced his own painful reckoning far away from the executive boardrooms where he once imagined his future unfolding. After losing his position, he returned briefly to Detroit to visit his parents, struggling to explain the decisions that had destroyed both his marriage and his career. Michael Price listened quietly as his son described everything that had happened, from the affair with Rachel to the moment he realized Sabrina had been the true owner of the company all along. Instead of anger, Jonathan's father spoke with quiet disappointment, reminding him that ambition without loyalty often leads people to betray the very things that once gave their lives meaning. Jonathan also spoke with his younger sister Olivia, who had always admired Sabrina's character. Hearing how deeply he had hurt the woman who supported him during his early struggles forced Jonathan to confront the full weight of his mistakes. As he returned to New York weeks later, he understood that rebuilding his life would not be easy. The success he once chased so fiercely had vanished, leaving behind a lesson far more powerful than the achievements he had once celebrated. Nearly 3 years after the dramatic events that reshaped Barnes Global Holdings, the company stood stronger than it had ever been before. Under the direct leadership of Sabrina Barnes, the organization underwent thoughtful reforms designed to strengthen transparency, fairness, and employee welfare. Sabrina did not rule from a distance like many corporate owners. Instead, she remained actively involved in both strategic planning and everyday operations, often walking through departments speaking with employees whose contributions were once overlooked. Daniel Brooks had been promoted to Director of Logistics Strategy after proving his integrity during the crisis, while Grace Morgan became Chief People Officer responsible for ensuring that workplace culture remained respectful and accountable. The board continued working closely with Sabrina and Linda Churchill, who now openly served as executive chairwoman rather than pretending to hold the ultimate authority. Employees gradually learned to admire Sabrina not only as the rightful owner of the company but as a leader who genuinely understood the daily struggles of those working beneath executive titles. The company's reputation grew stronger as clients and partners recognized that Barnes Global Holdings operated with a rare balance of intelligence and ethical leadership. Sabrina herself experienced a quiet personal transformation as time passed. The painful betrayal from Jonathan had left emotional scars, but she refused to allow bitterness to shape her future. Instead, she focused on honoring her father's vision by building a company culture where loyalty and humility mattered as much as business success. Outside of work, Sabrina maintained a peaceful life that remained simple despite her immense wealth. She often visited her late father's old office in Boston, reflecting on the lessons he had taught her about leadership and responsibility. Linda Churchill remained her closest ally and confidant, occasionally teasing Sabrina about how the quiet observer had become one of the most respected business leaders in the industry. Ethan Walker continued serving as legal counsel and trusted advisor, while Victor Langston, now retired from active board service, expressed pride in seeing Arthur Barnes's legacy protected by a daughter who possessed both wisdom and strength. Though Sabrina rarely spoke about the past publicly, she carried its lessons carefully, knowing that hardship had shaped her ability to lead with compassion and clarity. Jonathan Price's life followed a very different path after the collapse of his career. Returning to New York months after visiting his family, he accepted a modest consulting role in a smaller logistics firm that valued his technical expertise but knew little about his past. The experience humbled him deeply. Without the power or recognition he once enjoyed, Jonathan slowly rediscovered the discipline and humility that had driven him during his early struggles. He eventually apologized to Sabrina in a letter he never expected her to answer, expressing sincere regret for betraying both her trust and the values she had tried to teach him. Sabrina read the letter quietly but chose not to reopen old wounds, believing that forgiveness sometimes meant allowing people to rebuild their lives separately. Years later, as Jonathan walked past the towering headquarters of Barnes Global Holdings one evening, he paused briefly to look at the building that had once symbolized his greatest ambition. Instead of bitterness, he felt gratitude for the lesson it had given him. True success, he finally understood, was not measured by titles or influence but by loyalty, integrity, and the courage to remain faithful to the people who believed in you from the very beginning. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.